What is the relationship in modern day MMA between wrestling, MMA, jiu-jitsu, modern day grappling? There's so many terms being thrown around. And then obviously you have catch wrestling too. How do you look at it? Like, what is it? What's the combination of it that we see in today's time?
Well, I think even when it comes to what you might even consider like the submission grappling aspect of MMA, it's very much looking like catch these days. For a little bit of background, folk style, aka collegiate wrestling, is catch as catch can, where the term comes from in Lancashire, which meaning like get it any way you can, which means submission holds, pins, all this. But they would wrestle on the ground, whereas a lot of traditional wrestling styles, as soon as it gets to the floor or as soon as someone's back hits the mat from a throw, then it's over. But with the Lancashire grappling, they would keep going on the ground. Well, eventually, this becomes the prototype of what professional wrestling is. And these are all 100% real matches all over the world. And eventually it ends up, of course, in America. And there's lots of American champions like Frank Gotch and Joe Stecker and all these other catch wrestling giants that would become very famous wrestlers. But this eventually turns into folk style. So if you read the rules of a folk style booklet, and you can go back through the years and read how they've changed the nomenclature and such, there'll be terms in there like no chanceries. What that they mean is they mean directly on the neck without an arm. Or no wrist locks. They mean double wrist lock and top wrist lock. So they're using all these old terms from catch because folk style wrestling is catch wrestling. So the wrestling on the floor and the submission, they've just removed the submission aspect of wrestling out of what we now call folk style wrestling. And catch was even in the Olympics at one point for like a couple of them. And with my background, my lineage comes from this old catch and shoot wrestling background that was from Japan, from guys like Billy Robinson and Carl Gotch teaching the Japanese over there, people like who would become Sakuraba and Minoru Suzuki and Masakatsu Funaki and a whole bunch of people, Sakuraba guys on this card. Well, that's where I get my training from as well. This is where my history comes from and where I was developed. But you see tons of this stuff now showing up in jiu-jitsu competitions. You see it showing up in the UFC and MMA. Nobody's playing guard on their back anymore. It's not really effective unless there's such a technique and skill difference that the guy who's playing jiu-jitsu off his back can just peel this guy apart. But at the highest levels, you really can't get away with that kind of stuff anymore, especially with only 5 minutes. So what happens when someone gets taken down? They hand fight, they sit out, they hit stand-ups. Where do that's not jiu-jitsu. That's not what they do. This is all wrestling. And from that, catch wrestling would do similar. It's like, I'm not going to sit here and wrestle on my back, even if I have the capability to do it. I'm going to hand fight. I'm going to work up. I'm going to scramble. I'm going to get in on the leg. I'm going to go after it. But I also have the knowledge and the integration of all the submission elements as well. Plus, with catch, I came up with the term doing an interview for a Japanese magazine over there. And they're like, okay, describe the difference between jiu-jitsu and catch wrestling. And I just said, jiu-jitsu is the gentle art, catch wrestling is the violent art. And that stuck. And part of that's because we never had any limitation on what submissions we could use. Neck locks and face locks and all types of leg locks and all this different stuff that was like not trained and considered and was really considered poor taste in jiu-jitsu, right? Like you can't be cross-facing somebody in jiu-jitsu, they'd get pissed at you. And if you go on their legs, even if it was legal, they'd be like, oh, that's cheap shit, that's bullshit. But now leg locks are embedded into everything now, including Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And same with cross-facing to a degree and some of this stuff. And so it's all just been adapted into it. The only issue is people don't know where this shit's coming from. And they like to say, oh, well, this guy is developing this new jiu-jitsu. It's like, that's not new jiu-jitsu. This is the old as fuck. Go learn, go open a history book. And, even telling people that when the foundation of Brazilian jiu-jitsu owes its existence to catch as catch can in pro wrestling, because the eldest Gracie patriarch had a circus. And in that circus, in addition to other events and attractions, he had pro wrestling. And so Mitsuo Maeda came to Japan, to Brazil, to do pro wrestling down there in this Gracie's circus, and he went by the name Count Coma. Conde Coma, Count Coma. It's a pro wrestling name. And he worked professional wrestling matches, and he trained catch, he trained judo, old school jiu-jitsu, and then stayed and then taught the family members.
Helio? He taught Helio?
No, older than them. But even then, there's a famous Gracie, George Gracie. He was a catch wrestler as well. And he was one of the guys that would have to step up against some of these other family challenges. So if somebody might beat one of the guys, George would be one of the dudes they'd call to go get even with him.
Really?
Like Carlos or Carlson. You know, so, and even then I'll say, and by the way, go compare what you do in IBJJF to, let's say, the Fada or even the Gracie lineage back in the beginning. How do you think that they competed or attacked? Like, where was their wrestling strategy? Every single Gracie, except for, and even Helio would do this to a degree, but he developed a different game because of his physicality or lack thereof. But essentially, all those Gracies were throw you on the ground, pin you, submit you. And then, of course, the rule sets of IBJJF start gaming people towards these other strategies, towards winning these matches and these different concepts. Like, you know, I think it was the meows you had that were all doing this 50-50 stuff, and they're just getting these little advantages and sweeps, and they're winning that way. And it's not to say like these guys are not really good submission grapplers too. It's just that they're going out there trying to compete and win within the narrowest of margins because that's how tight it can be sometimes. But that isn't necessarily all there is to jiu-jitsu. And yet when you get to MMA and it's a different rule set, a different game starts developing.